Welcome to the Azure Stack HCI show, our first show in the new year. Happy New Year, Manfred. How are you doing today?
Yeah, fine. Thank you. Happy New Year to all that are watching us live or later in the recording.
Yeah, so new year and a lot of expectations about what's coming for Azure Stack HCI. I think we will have a bunch of shows this year. We know already that maybe in the next show in 2 weeks, we will have some announcements we can talk about. So there's no opportunity to go more into detail today, but stay curious and don't miss our next show today in 2 weeks. Today, we will talk about role-based management of VMs, clusters. So you all know that in Azure, we have a feature called the role-based access control. And today we want to talk about the question, how can we manage access control to clusters, to VMs in larger companies, for example, where you have different departments and some are allowed to do things and others are allowed to do other things. And Manfred prepared, as always, a live demo to show how it works and what is possible. And if you have any questions, so don't hesitate, raise your questions into the chat field, and we try to answer them immediately in the show. So Manfred, the stage is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Sven. Yeah, Sven mentioned it's a live demo, so not pre-recorded. And as you know, Azure Stack HCI today is still a preview. So all the things that we want to show to you, I've tested them yesterday, but we actually have several changes in the portal. So if something will not work as I explain it, you should keep in mind the explanation is how it should work, how it's intended to work, and how it will work when the Azure Stack HCI 23H2 version is released, when it's out of the public preview phase. First, what I want to show to you is again a few steps in the virtual machine management, because I have prepared some roles for us, and maybe we can show these roles to you. There's the Manfred, and Manfred is the global admin. So when I will work with my user, I'm the global admin, I will see everything. I've created a user Cosmos, and he is responsible for a specific cluster. So you will see we have several of the clusters, and we have a person Cosmos that is responsible for one cluster. And if he's responsible for this cluster, for sure, the expectation is that he should not see the rest. We have the same need when we talk about file servers and think about specific folders. If somebody is responsible for a folder, we don't want that this person sees the rest, because he's only responsible for this thing. To have the comparison, we have a second user, Rob. He's responsible for another cluster, the Azure Stack HCI 2303 CL. This is the third cluster in the environment. And then we have a user, Dan, and Dan is responsible only for virtual machine. The reason for this structure is to show you the different layers. We have the global admin, he sees everything. We have the cluster layer, we have the virtual machine layer, but we have also layers between. We could use this role-based access management, for example, also to say that we have somebody that can only manage the virtual hard disks of a virtual machine. This user then is responsible for everything on this virtual machine, so he has full control of the virtual machine, but not onto the cluster where the virtual machine is running, and not to the rest of the Azure infrastructure. So let's start first with the user Manfred, so our global admin, to see what's possible from the global admin perspective, because these steps are new for Azure Stack HCI 23H2, so for the version that will be released hopefully soon. I will switch to one of my clusters here. It's already a 23H2 preview version. And when I look to the virtual machines, I can see a list of virtual machines that are already deployed on this cluster. And for sure, if I'm a global admin, I can not only access this cluster, I can also access this cluster here, and I can also have a look at the virtual machines on this cluster. I can manage everything. I'm the global administrator with access rights to every object here inside in this Azure subscription. Let's have a look at the steps of the deployment of a virtual machine. We have seen this in a previous Azure Stack HCI show. I just go to create virtual machine here in the Azure portal, not in the Windows Admin Center, not in the failover cluster manager, not in the System Center virtual machine manager. I can select the resource group. I have for each cluster a resource group here to have a structure in there. I have a naming convention. This is seal 2301. And I will use VM, I think 95 or something like this should be free. I have a security type standard I will use here, and I have different gallery images. Let's deploy a Windows Server Data Center Azure edition here from the list. And I want to specify 4 virtual processors, 4 gigabytes of memory, static memory. I don't want to use the guest management. The guest management is a great feature because we have the virtual machine Arc enabled. We have the opportunity to bring the virtual machine automatically to the local domain, so it can be auto domain joined, but it needs additional time in the deployment because the Arc agent has to be configured and so on. So the reason why I remove it here is to save some time in the deployment, not because this is the recommended option. The recommended option for deployments in the field would be to enable guest management. A side note here, guest management might result in additional costs we have per virtual machine, because via this guest management we can bring policies to the machines. And if we, for example, enable the Defender functionality for this virtual machine, then for sure we have costs for Defender. So the guest management is similar to Azure Arc, where we always say Azure Arc itself does not bring additional costs to our environment, but Azure Arc is an interesting opportunity to enable additional services. And as soon as we enable additional services, for sure we have to pay for these additional services. And this is similar for the guest management. So in the field, you will see additional costs usually, because otherwise you don't have advantages from the guest management. The reason why I disable it is to increase or reduce the deployment time. Username, I will create a user Manfred on this machine. I want to have a password here. This follows the Azure requirements. So it's complex, it's minimum 12 characters. And then I don't want to add additional disks. I only use the disks I have for the operating system. I will choose a network configuration. So I will use my DHCP network, and I will use the CL2301 VM95 NIC01. This is what I want to use here. Okay. And no tags. Tags are very helpful when we are thinking about this role-based management, because if I'm on a, let's say, more global level, so maybe I'm responsible for the whole cluster, then it's helpful for me to be able to filter virtual machines for a specific department. So I could, for example, say, okay, this virtual machine is in a city, so maybe it's based in my city, where I'm actually here in my home office. It's City Würzburg. I could specify, for example, data center, maybe it's data center 01 and so on. And these tags can be used to filter the virtual machines I'm responsible for, and for sure, I also need the role-based access rights to be able to manage these machines. Okay, let's create this virtual machine. I assume this will work as expected. The deployment is created and the deployment is sent to the local resource bridge. And this is where I want to spend a few minutes to talk about, because we started in the Azure portal. So the steps we have seen with the user Manfred, they were triggered in the Azure portal. Actually, the Azure portal is creating the Azure Resource Manager template and is sending this via Azure Arc to the local Azure Arc resource bridge. The local Azure Arc resource bridge will use this information to deploy, based on a virtual machine image, this new virtual machine with a new virtual NIC. A question I receive very often: Manfred, can I also use third-party tools for virtual machine management? And for sure, Azure Stack HCI understands PowerShell, and many of these third-party tools are using PowerShell to manage the workload. So when we think about, or also Microsoft tools, let's start with the Microsoft tools. System Center Virtual Machine Manager uses PowerShell to address the local host to deploy some workload there. Windows Admin Center uses PowerShell in the backend to deploy workloads, to configure workloads on the specific machines. They all don't look at the role-based layer we have here. Here we have the roles in the Azure portal and the access management. We don't have this in the OS itself. This is the reason why the System Center Virtual Machine Manager builds its own security structure. There we have roles inside the Virtual Machine Manager. It's an additional layer that is added here. It's the same way how the third-party tools work that I know. The third-party tools I know, they create PowerShell in the backend to configure workloads locally. We shouldn't use this anymore with Azure Stack HCI 23H2. If you have any tool from Microsoft or from third party that uses the Azure Resource Management, then from my point of view, I'm not the product group, but from my point of view, what I have seen so far with Azure Stack HCI 23H2, this will work with the new version of Azure Stack HCI, because then I have a third-party tool that triggers the Azure Arc Resource Manager. The Azure Arc Resource Manager goes through the Arc, through the resource bridge, and deploys the workload on premises. We should not deploy new workloads direct locally. Why? For example, the network configuration is very specific in Azure Stack HCI 23H2 because it's also specific in Azure. And Azure Stack HCI 23H2 follows the logic we have in Azure. So we have something that is called a logical network. We don't have this in Hyper-V. We don't have this in the local environment. There we have virtual switches. But in Azure, we have this object logical network. The virtual disks, they store some meta information that is also stored in Azure. And if I create workloads locally, then if I do it correct, they might be visible in the Azure portal, but it's not the same than if I do it via the Azure portal. So the main recommendation here is ensure that you use the Azure portal for new workloads, or that you use tools that trigger the Azure portal. So the recommendation is not to use System Center Virtual Machine Manager for Azure Stack HCI 23H2. It's my recommendation. I don't know if there's any recommendation officially out from the product group, but the product group always says, we don't explain what you should not do. We explain what you should do. And the what should we do is, we should absolutely use Azure Portal to bring new workloads to Azure Stack HCI 23H2. This is what we also will see in the next steps when we look at the role-based model, where we want to delegate some controls to other users. Okay, so far, any questions? I see a question in the chat from Holger. So also not use Windows Admin Center to create manage VMs. yes, absolutely my recommendation not to use the Windows Admin Center, because Windows Admin Center is working locally. If Windows Admin Center will change the logic that Windows Admin Center will trigger the Azure portal to deploy the workload, then it's fine. But if you create it locally, you will miss this meta information that are so important to have the full Azure logic. Let's think about the deployment for Azure Virtual Desktop. I think we had this as a live demo in one of the previous shows. This Azure Virtual Desktop deployment wizard is only available via the Azure portal, because there we have a combination of Azure components like the host pool and the gateway and the local components. And it's similar for all these advantages like guest management and so on. Yes, we should use the Azure portal. Otherwise, let's say it in other words, if you have a scenario where you are not able to use the Azure portal, where this is not possible for you, then Azure Stack HCI 23H2 maybe is not the best solution for this scenario. On the other hand, if you are already using Azure and the Azure portal, the advantage is you don't have to learn everything new, because you are using the same ARM templates, you are using the same portal, you are using the same wizard. If you ever deployed Azure Virtual Desktop, for example, in Azure, these are the same steps on Azure Stack HCI. It's only one new click you have in the wizard where you can decide to deploy the virtual machine locally. Okay.
Oh, that's an interesting question. I had the same in the last show, you remember, Manfred?
Yeah.
Because in the past, we always told everyone to use Windows Admin Center as the new management tool for server infrastructure. And now Windows Admin Center is no longer relevant for Azure Stack HCI. But I had an internal discussion this week and about the positioning of Windows Admin Center of Azure Stack HCI. And it looks like that Azure Stack HCI is a solution. We are mostly targeting the edge. So we are talking about retail, manufacturing. We are talking about businesses with hundreds of sites or with thousands of stores. Everything is super scalable and repeatable. And the Windows Admin Center is a very cool solution for a small, mid-size environment, but not for a really big one. And that's why we focus on the Azure portal to manage Azure Stack HCI solutions. But Windows Admin Center keeps being super relevant, especially if you're a friend of Windows Server infrastructure. Then continue working with the Windows Admin Center. There will be a lot of improvements in the coming years, but not for Azure Stack HCI. Now we have the Azure portal for Azure Stack HCI, and I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and to add something here for this Windows Admin Center story, this does not mean that Windows Admin Center moves away, because let's have a look at my cluster here in the Azure Stack HCI environment, in the all clusters area here. And when I look to this cluster, this is the cluster where the deployment is actually running, then we also have a Windows Admin Center here. But this Windows Admin Center is hosted in Azure. Windows Admin Center inside this Windows Admin Center tool has no role-based model. So if I have the required management rights, I can do everything inside the Windows Admin Center. So there's no granular structure inside there. But the Windows Admin Center, for example, is used today still for managing the nodes, for managing volumes, for managing disks. I assume that for Azure Stack HCI, more and more of this Windows Admin Center features will move out of the Windows Admin Center into, let's say, direct listing inside this settings and resources setting. But today we still need the Admin Center for some jobs, but not for the VM management, because this is already available via the resources in the Azure portal with a few exceptions. So for example, if you use GPUs, then you will create the virtual machine via resources in the Azure portal. And then you will go to the Windows Admin Center and add the GPU partition to the virtual machine, because in this virtual machine deployment wizard, you have seen there was no step where it asked me about the GPU. This was not because I don't have GPUs in the cluster. This was because the wizard actually has not this step. So today it's a mix, but as Sven mentioned, the relevance for Windows Admin Center for Azure Stack HCI will be replaced by native Azure controls more and more. And for Windows Server, Windows Admin Center is still the modern management tool. Yeah. Okay. Now we have seen this capability of a user, of the user Manfred, that was able to do everything. Let's go to the complete opposite. Let's start with the user Dan, where we have a user that is only able to manage a single virtual machine, or that should be able only to manage a single virtual machine. Actually, Dan has not any access rights in the Azure portal. So he could log in, but he couldn't see anything. So let's give Dan the access right to this virtual machine. I wrote in the table, I can show you this later again, that Dan should be responsible for this virtual machine. Manfred can access this virtual machine. And Cosmos will also be able to access this virtual machine, because later Cosmos will be the user that is responsible for this whole cluster. But actually, we want to ensure that Dan is able to access this virtual machine, but not the virtual machine 22, 23. Maybe Dan is a developer, Dan is working on this virtual machine, and Dan needs to stop the virtual machine, start the virtual machine, restart the machine, maybe configure networking, maybe adding disks, but only for this machine. Okay. The configuration is done via the access control. So this is the important step where we have to work on this user, on this delegated control rights. So let's go to the access control. And the access control is available for every object in Azure. So, and because we are on the virtual machine 21, we are configuring access control for this machine. So this is the way how it's done. This is the scope we are working on. So here's always a button where I can see my access, because you can imagine in Azure, we have users, we have groups, we can have constellations between users. So users are members of different groups. So if you have a huge structure, maybe it's not clear in the first perspective what is exactly my access right on this object. But you should have a documentation for sure. Via this click on View My Access, you can always see, okay, what is my role? And here I can see, okay, I'm a security admin, I'm a Key Vault admin, I'm the VM contributor, so I'm able to work on the VMs. I have the device management role, and I'm the Azure Stack HCI administrator overall, so I can do everything here because I'm still logged in as Manfred. So let's add somebody here. We want to add the user, we want to add a role assignment, and this role assignment we want to add here is an Azure Stack HCI. Here we have always the description. Let's see what the different roles are. Let's start. So we have the Azure Connected Machine onboarding. This is a user that can onboard virtual machines via Azure Arc. So the Azure Connected Machines are Azure Arc enabled machines. The Azure Connected Machine Resource Administrator can read, write, delete, and re-onboard Azure Connected Machines. So can work on Azure Arc virtual machines, and this user can re-onboard them if something is going wrong. We have the Azure Connected Machine Resource Manager. This is a custom role for Azure Stack HCI for resource pools to manage hybrid compute machines and hybrid connectivity endpoints. And we have the Azure Stack HCI VM contributor that grants permission to perform all VM actions. So not all VM actions for all VMs, because we are on the level of a specific VM. So if I choose this option here, then the user that is selected in the members will be able to manage everything on this specific VM. As you can see, we can reduce the scope, and these are the default roles. We can also specify our own roles if you want to have specific attributes that are configurable by this user. Okay, Azure Stack HCI VM contributor. Let's go to next. I want to select a member here. The member is Dan. I want to use. In the field, you usually would use groups. So for example, Dan would be part of the developers, and the developers will be part of this role here. And then we have the review and assign. Okay, member is Dan. I don't have a description. And let's review and assign this here. So it takes a moment. So you should always keep this in mind. So the role assignment was working. Now it's finished. Now Dan should be part of this role that is able to manage exactly this virtual machine here. Exactly this virtual machine 21. So I will open an in private browsing session. This is important to ensure that I can use the Dan credentials, and I will go to portal to azure.azure.com. So this is the in private session here, and I will use the Dan at manfred.helber.de. This is my domain I'm using here. And Dan has a password. And it's the first login of Dan. I created the user for this demo, and I have a default policy that says, okay, you have to change your password with the first login. Let's do so. Okay, and now Dan should be able to sign into the portal. And let's first look to Azure Stack HCI. We have seen this Azure Stack HCI. Sorry, I will use HCI. So for sure, Azure Stack HCI, Dan can find this Azure Stack HCI. And then Dan will switch to the clusters. And we can see Dan has no cluster here. So there's no cluster listed. The difference, Manfred had all the clusters. He's the global admin. Let's see here, all clusters. Dan has not any cluster in the list here. The reason is Dan has no access right to any of the clusters. Now the issue is that Dan will not be able to navigate to this virtual machine because the virtual machine is part of this cluster. And so the cluster is actually the blocker for Dan. But this is not a big issue because we can give the direct URL link to Dan for exactly this virtual machine. And as you can see, I'm still the user Dan here. Dan is logged in, and Dan can access the virtual machine. And when I click on check access, I can see Dan is only this Azure Stack HCI VM contributor here. So he has exactly this right here. So unfortunately, it's actually in German language because this is a German language tenant. So I will not switch the language because then I have to log out and log in again with this user. But I think I can translate the buttons and you can see the correlation to the user Manfred here. So I clicked on view my access, and Dan has exactly this access right here, but only on this virtual machine. And now if we think about an efficient navigation here, for sure we have the situation that Dan can highlight this machine, then could say, okay, this is my machine. I received the link to this machine from my administrator. I will put this machine to the favorites. And in the future, when Dan will log in here, Dan will see in his favorite objects exactly this virtual machine, and he can access the virtual machine. He can still not access the cluster. He has no cluster, Azure Stack HCI cluster he can access. He cannot access any other virtual machine, only this virtual machine here. So, and for sure, this could be 2 virtual machines, 3 virtual machines. We could ensure that Dan has access to all virtual machines that have attribute, for example, development machines, or maybe a location A, B, C, D. This depends on your specific scenario. For which structure you would decide, if it's a structure based off the geographical region, or if it's a structure based on the job roles in the company. This is a situation you always have to think about and solve based on the company structure, and then we can bring this to the access management in the environment. Let's configure Cosmos and Rob on the cluster level. So it's comparable from the steps. When we go to the cluster, I have on the cluster level, this cluster 2301, I have the access control, and I could add a role assignment. And let's say we have a user that should be able to manage everything regarding VMs inside this cluster, but not the cluster itself. So the user should not work on the resource bridge, should not manage the cluster node itself, but the user, Cosmos, should be able to start all the virtual machines, change configuration of all the virtual machines in the cluster, do everything with virtual machines. So Cosmos will be an Azure Stack HCI VM contributor. Let's go to next. I want to add this user here. It's Cosmos, and we will add this user, and then we have a review and assign. I will log out with this user Dan here in my private browsing session. And as soon as the user is, the role is assigned, I can use the user Cosmos. And maybe for the user Cosmos, it would make sense to switch to English language for this user. So Cosmos. Maybe I have a typo in the Cosmos user.
Yeah, there's one S. Too much.
Ah, yeah. I have the typo here. Thank you, Sven. There's not the typo with the created user, but here is the typo. And let's create this or use this user. So in the users in the portal, for sure, I can use the region settings, and I could say, okay, it's better to use English here, and save this settings. And now back in the portal, now Cosmos is the person that has access rights to a whole cluster. So when Cosmos looks at, for example, let's compare this. When I go to let's see, for example, the Azure Arc in my AI environment and the machines here, I have a huge list with my user, with the user Manfred. When Cosmos does the same, Then he will use Arc. And in Azure Arc, when it goes to machines, the list is empty. But when Cosmos goes to HCI, he will see in all clusters exactly this cluster where I've specified the role for Cosmos. And Cosmos is not able to add nodes because I didn't allow this user to configure things on the host level, but I can create virtual machines. Sorry, I cannot create virtual machines because we didn't specify the Arc resource bridge access rights. This was the first topic in the list. And maybe you are wondering why Cosmos is not seeing any virtual machine here. The reason is Cosmos is able to manage virtual machines, but only virtual machines where he's also where he created the virtual machines. This would be possible if we add the Azure Arc resource bridge rights, or if we specify Cosmos as a user for specific virtual machines in this list. So now the difference to Dan, where Dan had only access to one virtual machine, I could, for example, decide to use again this virtual machine 21 here, this one here, and I could add Cosmos in the access control. Let's add here role assignment, and let's use the VM contributor. Let's add the member here, Cosmos. And let's do the same for another virtual machine. So for example, for this virtual machine 31 here. And then Cosmos will see two virtual machines in his list. So let's add the virtual machine contributor. Select the manage, and we use the Cosmos user. And after a few minutes, we should see exactly these two virtual machines here in the virtual machines list, because Cosmos now is here with the necessary access rights. Let me see. Maybe I missed the point that I should also add the resource bridge option here. Let's see. We are on the cluster level. We have the cluster 01. We have the control. And I mentioned that we have a specific right here for the resource bridge deployment role. And we'll add this one also for the user Cosmos here. And now let's wait till the deployment has finished. And let's check this again here. It's still not shown. So here we should see the two virtual machines. Let's try to access the virtual machines directly. Let's go to the virtual machines for the Cosmos, and Dan only had access to the virtual machine 21. Let's use the direct URL to the machine. And here Cosmos is able to access virtual machine 21. And let's use the virtual machine we had here, the virtual machine 01. We also have the access rights for the user Cosmos 01 here. He can also access directly this machine. Should work. Let's see. Here, let's highlight this machine and let's add this machine here. It's also possible to go to the 31. From the technical perspective, and this is where I mentioned that maybe we could see some issues here in the previous situation. From the technical perspective, my user Cosmos was missing the usage right for the resource bridge in the first step, but I added this in the live demo. And here we can see that it's still showing that the resource bridge might not be available, but it's configured in this environment. We are seeing this with the user Manfred. So something is actually not correct with the user rights inside this ecosystem, because the resource bridge itself is existing. We have the Azure Arc enablement, and the user Cosmos was configured via the access management in the Azure portal. And for sure, regarding the way how it should work, this should also be delegated to Azure Arc and the Azure Arc resource bridge. This is how it's expected, how it works. We will give the system a few minutes and check it again. If it will not work in the live demo today, this is a feature that will be absolutely there when the product is finally released, because this is how it's described. And this is how it exactly works. So you have the global layer. This is what Manfred is. You have the cluster layers, and you have the virtual machines. You have the objects inside the virtual machines. If you are thinking about having additional objects for bringing a structure in there, for example, things like containers or so on, then you have to work with objects like resource groups, for example. You could have a resource group where you have 2 or 3 clusters. And now it's your decision if you say, okay, I have here in this environment 5 clusters. I will use the access management for each cluster individually and add the users or the groups or the roles for each cluster. Or if you decide to bring all the clusters to one resource group, and then you could configure the access management based on this resource group, because for sure also the resource group object has this access management here. Does this make sense so far, Sven?
I think so, yes.
Okay. When you
So
are thinking
we have
about,
to find out what's exactly
yeah,
happening. So my understanding would be, if I am the administrator of the cluster, that I automatically should get access to everything on that cluster, so every VM. But we will see how it works in the final version.
yeah, we don't have this inheritance to be able to filter here, to be able to say, okay, we have a cluster and Manfred can create every virtual machine, but Manfred, it's not a good scenario for Manfred because I'm the global admin. Cosmos maybe has an access deny. This is also possible for a virtual machine, number 95, because this is a very specific virtual machine, and this should be not part of this cluster management. So we always have also the deny option on these different layers. And this is the reason why the not shown virtual machines in the cluster are absolutely what I expect here. What I don't expect at the moment is that I still have access issues to the resource bridge, and it still says there should be no resource bridge there. Because when we, for example, look at the logical networks, then I have also the resource bridge error here, let's say, but also in the logical networks, I could have my own networks. As we have seen, when Manfred deploys a virtual machine, Manfred can use the logical network with DHCP or with static configuration. We could delegate, for example, for Cosmos that he could deploy virtual machines, but only on the DHCP network or only on the static network. And the same thing for the VM images. I have a list of VM images The expectation is, and this is how it's described in this role-based model, that Cosmos should only see his own VM images. Actually, we have the situation that he does not see anything, because this access role matching to the resource bridge does not work. I can check this again, or we can use a view my access. Let's see here, what's the access? Yes, I added him here to the resource deployment role, to the VM contributor. We don't have a deny. This is what I mentioned, Sven. We also have the deny assignments. This is helpful if I have a user that is allowed to do nearly everything, but he's not allowed to use a specific network or to use a specific image. Then it's easier to say, okay, you are allowed to use the whole cluster, but not this specific resource, because then I have this result with one click, and the deny always results. So if I have a deny configured, the deny is what is seen in the view my access result. But for sure, I can have the allow access rights in the rest of the cluster and deny on the network. Let's check a last thing on this cluster. We had a third role assignment where I mentioned it's only for the cluster host. Maybe we have in the preview situation here still a relationship to the host area. Let's add also the third option to this user Cosmos here, the HCI device management role. This should be only necessary for a user that is responsible for the host management. But let's add this also for the user Cosmos. And let's see if this changes something. So role is added. When I now use the user here, the user Cosmos, view my access, then we have the third role. Let's see if this changes anything here for this specific cluster. When I go to virtual machines, no, it's still an issue with the resource bridge. And for sure, we don't need a resource bridge as it's intended here for each user. We have one resource bridge for the whole cluster. And this resource bridge receives the commands from the Azure portal, receives the templates, and for sure also receives the roles and the role-based management. It worked for the VMs. On the VM level, there we were successful in the live demo. So this is, let's say, ready for production. On the resource bridge level, we have seen some issues. I will try to find out maybe this for the next show or the show after the next show, if this really was a technical thing or if I did something wrong. Based on the documentation, the steps are exactly what we have seen. We are configuring the roles in the Azure portal, and they work in the whole structure we have here for Arc, for Resource Bridge, and so on. So if you have this need, if you need a structure, you don't need this third party or Microsoft additional tools any longer, because in the past, we had the System Center Virtual Machine Manager here that added this, because Hyper-V itself is a flat structure. We could not say, okay, the Dan is responsible for one virtual machine. If Dan was a Hyper-V administrator, he could see all the virtual machines. Now we had only the single virtual machine. Cosmos had these two virtual machines with the limitation that we planned to give him full access to the cluster. This didn't completely work. He could see the cluster. I think this was good. This worked. We have seen that Cosmos had access to the cluster. He didn't see the other clusters. He only sees one Azure Stack HCI cluster here. So this is again a filter based on the access control. And so you can bring a structure to your resources and delegate controls. This is what is the need of many customers, to have this delegation, because they don't have one of these clusters, as Sven mentioned, but maybe they have 100 locations, and in each location one cluster. And then we have administrators that are responsible for Germany, and others that are responsible for France, Switzerland, Austria, and so on. Okay, any additional questions to this role management, to this delegation management?
So there are no questions from the audience, but a comment. So we are handling 1 or 2 VMs at the moment. So in real scenarios, we will have dozens or hundreds of VMs. And then, of course, we are using the tagging to get an overview about what the VMs are, where they are located, what the target group of that VM is, and so on and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. Then we will use the tagging to filter these virtual machines first. And for sure, we can select several of these machines, but not all the activities are available for this multi-VM management here. But as always, we can use the command line interface in Azure. So if I didn't plan initially with this role-based model and I want to add this to these virtual machines afterwards, I have to classify this machine somehow. So maybe I have these virtual machines that have this AVD in the name. These are Azure Virtual Desktop machines. There we have a responsible for admin number 1, and the other virtual machines we have the responsible for admin number 2. This is actually not configurable via the graphical user interface. There I have to configure every object individually, but for sure I can script this. I could generate a script that adds, for example, Rob to the AVD virtual machines and Dan to the rest of the virtual machines.
Yeah. So no more comments, no questions. So I guess we are at the end of today's show. And I had to say thank you, Manfred, for the demo. And as always, after the show is before the next show. And the next show will be February 2nd. So today in 2 weeks, we will talk about all the new things, announcements that will happen in the next 2 weeks. So I'm very curious what we are able to share in 2 weeks. And if you do not want to miss anything, so it makes sense to follow us on Azure Stack HCI Tech Talk, for example. This is a LinkedIn community only talking about Azure Stack HCI. And we have Azure Stack HCI Tech Talk on YouTube as well. And of course, it makes sense to follow Manfred and myself on LinkedIn in our private channels as well. So there are a lot of opportunities to follow us. And as always, now we will switch to German language because we have some German topics we would like to talk about at the end. And we say goodbye to all our international friends and see you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Ja, die Hybrid Show, Manfred. Da habt ihr ja ein bisschen was verändert.
Genau.
Die findet jetzt zwar immer noch freitags statt, alle 14 Tage, aber nicht mehr wie gewohnt nach der Azure Stack HCI, sondern vor der Azure Stack HCI Show.
Genau.
Bedeutet, wir haben jetzt nicht mehr die Möglichkeit, darüber zu sprechen, was in der Show nachher dran kommt, sondern wir können erzählen, was in der Show vorher dran kam. Und ihr habt dann die Möglichkeit, das einfach on demand anzuschauen. Was war denn heute Teil der Hybrid Show?
Heute haben wir über das Azure Stack HCI Cloud-Based Deployment gesprochen, was wir hier auch schon mal gemacht haben in englischer Sprache. Da hat sich seit der Azure Stack HCI Show, wo wir darüber gesprochen haben, ein bisschen was geändert. Also es sind schon wieder Dinge neu. Es ist ja noch eine Preview, da ist immer noch ein bisschen Dynamik drin. Und das haben wir uns heute angeschaut, weil es da ja viel Feedback gibt von Leuten, die Probleme haben, weil halt Dinge anders sind. Und das haben wir einfach noch mal ein bisschen erklärt, worauf zu achten ist. Ja.
Genau, und ansonsten gibt es dann noch die On-Prem-Show, die du mit dem Carsten machst und die Azure Arc Show, die du mit dem Alexander machst.
Ja.
Und ja, nachdem jetzt, sagen wir mal, die Hybrid Show ja auch schon mal vor der Azure Stack HCI Show kam, haben wir es auf jeden Fall jetzt so umgesetzt, dass wir die anstehenden Sendungen immer versuchen, in den WBSC-Kalender reinzubringen. Das heißt, im WBSC-Kalender könnt ihr euch abonnieren in euren eigenen Kalender rein. Unter manfredhelber.de/Kalender könnt ihr eine Anleitung runterladen, wie das funktioniert. Kann ich nur empfehlen, das einfach mal zu tun. Dann verpasst ihr da nichts. Das heißt, hier findet ihr sämtliche Aktivitäten der Azure Stack HCI Show, der Hybrid Show, der On-Prem Show und der Azure Arc Show. Kann ich nur empfehlen. Und wenn ihr statt Kalender hinter manfredhelber.de/den Newsletter eintragt, dann habt ihr die Möglichkeit, eben auch einen klassischen Newsletter von Manfred zu bekommen. Da sind dann die Aktivitäten auch drin. Es gibt so eine Veranstaltung, die du planst, ich glaube im April oder Mai, ne, ist das zum Thema Windows Server. Die kann man auch zum Beispiel im Kalender finden und die findet man aber auch, wenn man den Newsletter da abonniert hat, weil da haben sich schon ganz, ganz viele angemeldet. Magst vielleicht über den Windows Server Summit etwas erzählen?
Sehr gut, ich blende mal den Ticker unten ein. Genau, Windows Server Summit ist am 8. und 9. April in Würzburg, ist eine zweitägige Veranstaltung zu Windows Server mit, glaube ich, sehr vielen spannenden Themen, weil sich ja auch mit dem nächsten Windows Server viel ändert. Im positiven Sinn muss man sagen. Aber
Mhm.
jetzt wird die Qual der Wahl umso größer. Also ich finde, Azure Stack HCI macht mit der Version 23H2 einen Riesenschritt in Richtung echt Hybrid. Und auf der anderen Seite haben wir den Windows Server, der in der nächsten Version einen Riesenschritt macht im Bereich Hyper-V und im Bereich Storage Spaces Direct. Und jetzt muss man sich natürlich wieder angucken, was ist denn die richtige Lösung? Vielleicht wird man auch beides im Einsatz haben, im Data Center dann so ein Windows Server und in den Remote Locations Azure Stack HCI. Und auf dieser Veranstaltung, wo jetzt gerade der Ticker unten durchläuft, da geht es eben schwerpunktmäßig um Windows Server. Es gibt aber auch eine Session, wo wir das so ein bisschen vergleichen, wo von welcher der Lösungen die Stärken liegen. Ja.
Ja, ich freue mich auf jeden Fall auf den Summit. Ich freue mich auf die nächste HCI-Show dann in 14 Tagen. Und jetzt freue
Ich
ich mich
auch,
vor
ja.
allem aufs Wochenende. Und ich hoffe, dass wir ein bisschen schönes Wetter haben und alle dann entspannt am Montag wieder zurückkommen. Dann sage ich an der Stelle vielen Dank fürs Zuschauen. Vielen Dank, Manfred, für die Vorbereitung und Durchführung und übergebe dann die letzten Worte wie immer an dich. Vielen Dank und Tschüss von meiner Seite.
Ja, dem schließe ich mich an. Sonst habe ich immer gesagt, ich hoffe, ihr bleibt noch bis zur Hybrid-Show dabei. Aber die war jetzt ja heute schon. Da hoffe ich, dass ihr in Zukunft einfach immer um 10 Uhr einschaltet. Da waren heute aber wirklich viele dabei. Also von daher in 2 Wochen wieder um 10 Uhr. Und ansonsten ein schönes Wochenende euch, wo ihr jetzt wohlverdient in den Freitagnachmittag gehen könnt. Und ich freue mich auch schon auf in 2 Wochen. Schauen wir mal, was es bis dahin alles Neues gibt. Bis dahin, macht's gut. Tschüss.